This screencast is on the American Revolution. Throughout this presentation, we'll discuss the causes and effects of the war. European nations were squabbling to see who could be the big kahuna or the top dog. They were especially competing with each other for world resources, military strength, and political superiority. Some nations were upsetting the balance of power. Meanwhile, in America, colonists had some ideas of their own. They were ready to leave their parent country and start fresh. The American Revolution, also called the War of Independence, started in 1775. The first shots were fired in Massachusetts in Concord and Lexington. It caused America to separate from Great Britain and thus help create a new nation. The war was fought for 8 years and ended in 1783. The Revolution wasn't an impulsive act that just happened overnight. There are multiple historical events leading up to the fighting of the Revolution. The major causes in chronological order are the French and Indian War, the Sugar Act, and the Stamp Act. Two European nations, France and Great Britain, were fighting over who got custody and control of North America. The colonists and some Native Americans from the Iroquois Confederacy were allied with the British against the French and other Native American tribes from the Algonquin and Huron tribes. Great Britain hadn't budgeted for such an expensive war. Great Britain needed money to pay for the war debts, which had nearly doubled. Thus, Great Britain expected the colonies to help pay for their protection during the French and Indian War. The war lasted for 9 years and ended in 1763. Making colonists purchase British-made goods instead of products from the French West Indies was Great Britain's first plan to regain lost moneys. Great Britain passed the Sugar Act, which included a tax on all non-British imports to strongly encourage colonists to buy British. This act was also an attempt to regulate American smuggling. The act called for a tax of 3 pence on every gallon of molasses, taxed wine and other goods, and provided for strict enforcement. The colonists hated the Stamp Act. It deeply impacted and infuriated American lawyers who dealt with legal documents. Many of these lawyers, including Sam and John Adams, were vital contributors to the revolutionary movement. Great Britain didn't stop there. The British continued to pass a series of laws to restrict the colonies and hold them partly responsible, once again, for British protection from possible attacks by the French or Native Americans. The Townshend Acts eventually led to the Boston Massacre and Boston Tea Party, but the Intolerable Acts, as the colonists nicknamed them, prompted the large-scale revolt by outraged colonists against Great Britain's King George III. The Townshend Acts, or duties, were the last straw. They were an attempt to get Americans to pay extra taxes on a variety of items most often used in the colonies, such as tea, red and white lead, which were paint pigments, glass, and paint tints. The money raised by taxation was used to pay royal governors in Great Britain, and the colonists had no official representation within the government. No taxation without representation became a rallying cry for American revolutionaries. It's hard to believe, but a snowball fight led to the very first casualties of the war. It took place in the center of Boston, 5 years before the first actual battle. Americans were throwing snowballs at British sentries. One British soldier fell on ice, causing his rifle to discharge. This accidental firing led to the historical Boston Massacre, in which 5 colonists were killed. Parliament canceled the Townshend duties, all except for the tea tax, shortly after. Tea, along with beer, was the favorite drink in the colonies. When the British undersold smuggled tea, thus threatening American trade, the Sons of Liberty, an organization of colonists ready for revolution against Great Britain's king, had a tea party at Boston Harbor. The group disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians, crept onto the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, and dumped 342 crates of tea into the Boston Harbor water. Mixed reaction met the event, and some colonists, including Ben Franklin, thought the tea should be paid for. Many colonists promised to change their drinking habits to something other than British tea, but that movement was short-lived. The British had to retaliate to save face. They couldn't let this act go unpunished. They responded to the Tea Party by toughening their stand against the colonies, passing a series of intolerable acts which restricted the colonies in numerous ways, including closing the port of Boston, which was essential to the colonists for importing and exporting goods, banning colonists from holding town meetings, and having British officials who had committed crimes sent from the colonies to Great Britain for trial, where they were rarely prosecuted. 56 colonial leaders, including George Washington, Patrick Henry, and Sam Adams, decided to figure out what course of action to take after the intolerable acts were passed. They met in Philadelphia in 1774 and became known as the First Continental Congress. The First Continental Congress agreed to the following measures to let Great Britain know they meant business: boycott British goods, arm themselves, and form trained militias, and appeal directly to King George III. The king seemed to be too dignified and important to be bothered with trivial demands by the menial colonists. King George III, the leader of Great Britain, continued to be bothered by the rebels in the 13 colonies. He refused to allow for colonist representation in Parliament. He did nothing to pacify the American colonists and continued to disregard their requests. Enough was enough. American colonists stockpiled weapons and conquered Massachusetts outside Boston. Then fighting began. The first battles occurred outside Boston in Lexington and Concord. It is often called the shot heard around the world, as 13 colonies decided to challenge the mighty British Empire. Paul Revere, one of the Sons of Liberty, warned colonists, "The British are coming." Paul Revere actually wouldn't have said the British are coming. This wouldn't have made any sense because many in Concord and Lexington and the colonies in general considered themselves British, and so riding in and shouting the British are coming wouldn't have made sense. He would have shouted something like the regulars are coming or the redcoats are coming, which would have made more sense to the colonists at the time. This was truly a mismatched battle from the start, but the outcome was monumental. Farmers and shopkeepers responded to Paul Revere's call to arms by being ready to fight at a minute's notice, earning them the nickname Minutemen. 17 Minutemen were waiting for the British soldiers at the village green on April 19, 1775. Historians are still uncertain about which side fired the first shot. Approximately 50 American colonists were killed, and 45 were wounded or missing. The British, on the other hand, lost approximately 65 soldiers, and 208 were wounded or missing. The battle was a humiliating defeat for the British, who had more organized, highly trained militias. However, they didn't use guerrilla warfare, as the Minutemen chose to do, and thus the British were unprepared for ambushes and easily slaughtered. This map shows the routes that Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Dr. Samuel Prescott would have taken to warn that the British were coming. And remember, the term British wouldn't have been used. They would have said the regulars are coming to let people know that they meant the British Army. And you can also see where the British patrols were. And these three individuals were charged with warning either they're coming by land or they're coming by sea. And this is where the term one if by land, two if by sea. There was actually a church where they would have posted either one lantern or two lanterns to tell whether the British were traveling by sea or by land. One lantern meant land, two lanterns meant by sea. That's where you get the statement, one if by land, two if by sea. Paul Revere was actually captured on his ride. His name was used because it was easier to rhyme than Dr. Samuel Prescott's last name. And Dr. Prescott would have actually been the one who successfully made the ride. And the reason why is because he was a doctor and the British troops would have allowed him to pass.